Hi, everyone. So today we are going to start on the Great Depression. It kind of goes over chapter 32 and 33, and then after that we only have 34 and 35. So once we finish this one, we're only going to have three more. This chapter, though, really what it's doing is laying the groundwork, kind of to explain how it is that a situation came about to where the Great Depression happened. Now, we just finished with chapter 31, and 31 was all about society during the Roaring Twenties. This talks about politics at that time, right? So get prepared for that. We're going to go over the three administrations of Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, right? So let's look at those and the events that are taking place in the United States at that time politically. So here are some of the main characteristics of what's going on politically at this time. Keep in mind from chapter 31, America turned inward. There we were politically isolationist because we didn't want to get involved in this foreign intervention after World War I. With everything that was taking place there and the idealism of Woodrow Wilson, also changing from the progressive era, kind of getting back to business as usual with focusing more on the economy, and that's why the economy was just soaring during the 1920s, right? Government tried to work in cooperation with big business to better serve the American people. Unfortunately, though, there were some in government who were corrupt. This was mostly during the Harding administration. You're going to see this. It's unclear whether he knew about it or not, but it all comes to light after he dies. It's very similar to, at least the corruption is, to the Grant administration, as you're going to see, and hopefully what you've read. Okay, here's an image of Warren G. Harding. He kind of has the eyebrows like McKinley, right? But anyway, he would be president for only a short time, a couple of years, March of 1921 to August 1923. He was very popular while he was president. People really liked him. After Woodrow Wilson, we turn inward, and there is this isolationism, and he wholeheartedly agree with that. And as I said, there's a return to normalcy after the progressive era and then after World War One. The one thing is he had certain people close to him, kind of like Grant, who he trusted, but they were corrupt. One person, Albert Fall, you're going to see he's going to be involved in a scandal. He's the Secretary of the Interior. The Secretary of the Interior is supposed to watch over the environment and protect it and that sort of thing and oversee it, but he was not a conservationist. And then there's the Attorney General, Dougherty. He was actually a crook, and he's going to siphon off money from the taxpayers, as you're going to see. Okay, so this is the election of 1920. Remember that Woodrow Wilson called this a solemn referendum because if the American people voted for this, then they would want the Treaty of Versailles, which we never agreed to, right? And Warren G. Harding is going to become president, and Congress is just going to end World War I with a simple resolution. So anyway, I want you to look, though, at this election. We have Warren G. Harding. His vice president is Calvin Coolidge. But then the Democrats, they chose the Ohio governor, James Cox, and his vice presidential running mate was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And of course, we're going to hear more from him. He's going to run for president and win in 1932. Okay, so as I mentioned, Harding and then the other two Republican presidents that follow him want a return to normalcy. So for them, that means a return to laissez-faire. Sort of the business of government is business. So this is post-progressive era, post-World War I. They really want to help stimulate the economy, reduce taxes, lower regulations on big businesses so that the economy can really expand. And it did, right? During the 1920s, it was a roaring economy. One thing that they did, one way in which this occurred is that the Supreme Court favored business, kind of like the Marshall Court. So their rulings favored contract law and that sort of things. Oftentimes they circumvented antitrust law. Ironically, though, the court was headed up by William Howard Taft, who was a real trust buster, right? He is now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's going to be appointed by Harding, right? And then Hoover, he comes in and he wants businesses, rather than regulating them, he wants them to regulate themselves. So, which they're all about the profit. So we'll see how that works. All right, so here is Warren, or here is Harding, as if I know him personally. Here's Harding's cabinet. He's sitting around the, I guess it would have been like the Oval Office. I'm not exactly sure what room this is in the White House, but he had some really great people. As a matter of fact, Charles Evans Hughes was a wonderful Secretary of State. Andrew Mellon, as you know, he was the Secretary of Treasury throughout the 1920s, and it's probably because of his administration. They cut taxes on the rich and the poor. They also balanced the budget and got rid of some of the debt, right? So this was his plan. It would be a dream for Republicans. And then Herbert Hoover, he was the Secretary of Commerce, and he actually did a very good job in that role, right? And so what you're going to see is that he's going to go on to become president. But there are other people here too, like Doherty, and then also Albert Fall and others who are there in his cabinet, as you're going to see, who were corrupt. Okay, this is the Taft court. Notice that William Howard Taft is much thinner than when he was president. Actually lost a lot of weight. He was a lot happier not being president, and he had a real keen legal mind, and so this was something that he really loved. This is a very white male court. Louis Brandeis is on here, though, and he is the first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court. Another thing I wanted to mention about Louis Brandeis is he's the first that kind of came up with the idea of right to privacy. So the Fourth Amendment says that you have freedom from wrongful search and seizures, and you should have safety in your possessions and papers and that sort of thing. He kind of extended it more to you should have privacy in other things. So at that time, telegraph lines, people would tap into them and you could see what was going there. If your mail or your letters were in the mail, somebody had that sort of thing. So he kind of looked at that too. But anyway, here's some other examples of rulings that were made by the Taft court. So one was a federal child labor law. Again, the court was hesitant to allow laws that were nationwide, right? It should, it should allow just within states could regulate within their borders, but it wouldn't go from state to state. So here, this Bailey versus Drexel Furniture Company, businesses basically had to pay a fee if they had children there. And they said that the penalty for this, it wasn't a tax, right? And because it wasn't a tax, it was unconstitutional, and it wrongly targeted one business over the other. And it said that the 10th Amendment gave the states the right to rule on issues such as child labor. So if they wanted to have child labor, then theoretically they could. All right, and then if you recall Mueller versus Oregon, this one was overturned with Adkins versus Children's Hospital in 1923. So what had happened is Congress tried to pass this law, which gave a mandatory minimum wage for women in the District of Columbia, because Congress can regulate the events that take place in that city. But then some people argued against that, saying that it violated their Fifth Amendment right to contract and private property and that sort of thing. And in their ruling, the court said, it was supposed back when it was the Mueller ruling, it was back when men and women were quite different in the sense that women were seen as the weaker sex, but they had taken such great strides. Since then, they had the right to vote, and so as a result, they don't need special conditions. So this overturned Mueller, and it got rid of the minimum wage and working hours for women. Okay, so here are some other things that took place. This is like after the war. Remember that the federal government came in and they kind of took control of the merchant marines. That's ships that go and travel internationally to do trade, buying and selling goods and that sort of thing, importing and exporting. And also they took over the railroad. Well, the Esch-Cummins Transportation Act, what this did is it turned the railroads back over to the private companies and provided compensation to them for using them during the war. There's also the Merchant Marine Act, and what this did is it got rid of certain ships that they had accumulated during World War I. And then there's the passage of this one, the La Follette Seamen's Act, and I think I've got a slide to show you more about that, but it really regulated the working conditions for sailors who worked on ships who went and imported and exported goods out of the United States. Okay, so here's some aspects of that law. One thing, if you were working on a ship and then you just left, you couldn't be imprisoned for that. They reduced the penalties for disobedience, so you couldn't be flogged or whatever they did on the ship, right? They regulated your hours, both at sea and in port, so that you couldn't be overworked. They established the rations that you're supposed to get. So while you're on the ship, you should get a minimum amount of food, water, supplies, those sorts of things. It regulated wages. You had to have certain safety precautions, lifeboats, life jackets, that sort of thing. And what did it say here? A minimum percentage of seamen aboard a vessel to be specified. Oh, able seamen. So you had to have skilled people on there. And it said 75% of them have to understand the language that is spoken on the ship. So this was really good for those sailors who worked on these ships. The problem is that some people, rather than using American ships because they were more expensive, it hurt the American shipping industry because then people started going to other ships where they didn't have to pay as much. So it was good for the worker, bad for business, so to speak. Okay, and here's Bob La Follette and a couple of his buddies that worked to get that passed. You remember Bob La Follette? He was one of the progressive guys. To our right and his left is Lincoln Steffens, right? And then there's also a labor leader on the left, Andrew Farusith, right? So they're all kind of like-minded progressives. Okay, so with labor, during the war, everybody's working for this war effort, but after the war, people are working for better working conditions, shorter hours, more pay, and so we're going to get a series of labor strikes, right? One is the Great Steel Strike of 1919. This ended after just 3 months, and they really didn't get it was disastrous for them, right? And what happened is they're trying to strike during the Red Scare when there's all this angst about immigration, about anarchists and communists and socialists and everything. And so to many Americans at that time, the labor unions looked too much like leftists. Right, so they didn't get very far there. One thing, too, if you look at the Railroad Labor Board right here, what they did after the war is wages were cut because this was a board that was created. Wages were actually cut for railroad workers by 12%. So this was very detrimental for them. What happened? They went on strike, and that was ended by a court injunction by the Attorney General. And what you're going to see is that labor membership decreases significantly during this time. And it makes sense because of the mood of the nation. It's anti-leftist, anti-anarchy, that sort of thing. Plus, you have a whole flood of people coming into the country. And so workers really couldn't unite because they had no leverage. Because if you went on strike or anything like that, you'd just be fired and you'd bring in somebody, they would bring in somebody else, who could do your job. All right, so here's a little bit more about the Great Steel Strike of 1919. The AFL put it on, but it was two different organizations. It was the Amalgamated Association Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers. They were part of the American Federation of Labor. There were a lot of people. It was a nationwide strike. About 350,000 were involved in it. But as I said, it was put down because it just didn't get the momentum that it needed. Americans really didn't support it. Okay, this graph right here shows how union membership decreased significantly during the 1920s. Because of laws that are going to be passed during the Great Depression and during World War II, labor is really going to start to soar. It's going to peak in the 1950s, and ever since then it's been going down. Okay, here this shows where it peaked, right? 1954, and then from there it just goes down. Most people who are in unions today are in the service industry, secretarial, government, teaching. So that's where a lot of the union membership is. Um, not because people who work in industry aren't unionized, it's just that few people work in industry in the United States anymore. Most people work in the service industry. Okay, so after World War I, there were some benefits for veterans. We get Veterans Bureau, which was created, right? And so they have hospitals providing services for rehabilitation and services for the disabled. Also, private organizations were created that became lobbying organizations. So one here, Special Interest Group, the American Legion. It was founded in Paris. Teddy Roosevelt Legionnaires is what it was called, right? And so they want the dough, right, for the doughboys. So what they're seeking is lost wages, because let's say you're a doctor, and then the government says you have to go to war. When you go to war, you only get paid what the government's going to pay you. You're not going to get paid as a doctor anymore. And so a lot of these people had lost wages, and so they think that they should get that money back. So they are lobbying for this. The American Legion is in Congress. And so Congress passes what's known as the bonus bill in 1922, and that would be the payment for lost wages. Harding vetoed it twice, right? But in 1924, they're going to pass another one, and it's Adjustment Compensation Act, also known as the bonus bill. And what this did, they were going to get this insurance policy, and it would be after 20 years, they were going to get it. So it'd be like a bonus, right? Coolidge vetoed it, but then this time Congress overrode the veto, right? But that added a huge cost to the war, $3 to $5 billion more for World War I. Okay, in foreign affairs, as I said, America really wasn't ready for World War II because they kind of had this false sense of security because of agreements that they were making elsewhere. So Congress ended the war with a simple resolution, joint resolution in 1921. We never joined the League of Nations, right? The irreconcilables were successful in ensuring that Congress never passed that. Right. So we have an observer there, but that's it. We're also getting involved in the Middle East where they start to drill for oil, and the United States, different companies like Shell and Exxon are getting rights to drill in the region. Okay, so this is the League of Nations building in Geneva, Switzerland that we never were part of. As I indicated before, the United States kind of had this false sense of security because they were making these international agreements, believing that, we're going to outlaw war, we're going to reduce armaments, and so we didn't build them up. And this is where it begins. It was a great idea. It was the Washington Naval Conference. It was the first time ever in the history of nations in which an international group came together to reduce armaments around the world. So this is Charles Evans Hughes. He was the Secretary of State who put this together. It was November of 1921 through February of 1922. So it's quite a few weeks, right? I'm thinking, gosh, few months, right? So all these countries come to the United States. They go to Washington, D.C., and what they're going to do is basically, well, Hughes proposes this 10-year holiday on constructing more battleships, but not only that, they're going to reduce other armaments as well. They're going to agree to settle some disputes on land and that sort of thing. What had happened after World War I is some countries, not the United States, built up their military, right? So some of the nations that were there, Britain, Japan, France, Italy, you can see them right there. And then some other countries too in the Pacific Rim, like China, and then the Netherlands were there, Belgium and Portugal. Russia was not invited to this naval conference. Okay, so here is one of the treaties that come out of it. This is going to be the U.S., Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy, the five-power treaty. So the main powers in Germany, or in Europe, not Germany, the US, and then the main power in Asia, which was Japan. So what they wanted to do is they're going to have this, they're going to want to maintain sort of the level of power that they have at that time in terms of ships. So the US and Britain could have 5, right? Japan could have 3, and then France and Italy each could have 1.7, right? That's the way that they kind of settled it right there, kind of keep it, maintain the status quo and the balance of power that they have. The United States, too, agreed that they were going to get rid of 30 of their warships, right, as a result of the treaty, and they did that February of 1922. 3 major treaties were drawn up. Another thing, we couldn't fortify our East Asian possessions. Japan could, because that's where Japan is, right? So they could fortify there. And then China, again, they're going to continue with the open door policy that they had in play ever since like the 1870s. Okay, and then this is the four-power treaty. This is basically those countries in the Pacific who have territory in the Pacific would respect the interest of others there, right? So as the United States, Great Britain, France, and Japan, Britain had Hong Kong, the United States had Guam, the Philippines, France had French Indochina, and then, of course, Japan had Japan, and Japan was trying to carve up parts of China as well. And then each country was supposed to inform the other countries if there is an attack, right, or there's going to be an attack. So again, this is to maintain the status quo in the Pacific and then the balance of power between these nations. Okay, and the 9-power treaties. These are the big 4, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Portugal, China. They all do this. And what they do is they endorse the open door policy in China, but China was guaranteed its independence. All right, and then this one, you gotta love this one. This is the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. It was named after our Secretary of State, Frank Kellogg, right? So this is in 28. He is going to end up getting the Nobel Peace Prize for this. And then the French Foreign Minister, Aristide Briand. So what they did, they came together. There were 62 nations. They renounced war. They sign off on this. 1928. It's going to be 11 years before World War II happens, right? So basically, this is just like, you know, we're not going to have wars. We don't have to worry about it. It didn't ban defensive wars, though, so you could go to war if you're invaded by another country. All right, and then what we see is this is going to be problematic because we start to see tariffs, right? Again, and this was to protect American business interests here. So what we did is we increased our tariff on production from 27%. That was the Wilson-Underwood tariff. Remember, Woodrow Wilson wanted to lower the tariff. And so after Wilson, it is raised again to 38.5% on some goods. The problem with this is that our farmers were producing an overabundance of crops. And during World War I, there was a high demand for them in Europe. The demand was gone, right? And so when we impose tariffs, then other countries impose tariffs on us. And so people are not buying our agricultural products. And so this really hurt the farmers. They're really hurting during the 1920s. Okay, so you can see these tariffs right here, right? The higher ones, remember the tariff of abomination? over here, right? Whoops. That was one of the first one. Here, these were tariffs during the Civil War. Um, here, this is the Underwood tariff, right? So this is when Wilson was in office. So what we're going to get, we're going to end up getting higher tariffs. This one's going up right here, and then it's going to go up again. So it's going to be problematic, and it's going to help to lead not only to the Great Depression, where trade among nations is just going to be halted, but it's also going to irritate sort of like international affairs and help to create World War II. All right, so here are some of the scandals that happened during the Harding administration. The guy who was in charge of the new Veterans Bureau, right? Colonel Forbes over here, looked like he was embezzling money. He extorted, got bribes or other things, $200 million. And then this one right here, the Teapot Dome scandal. So this was Albert Fall. So Teapot Dome, that's oil reserves, U.S. oil reserves in Wyoming. There's also at Elk Hill. The guy who's in charge of the Department of Interior who oversaw this was Albert Fall. Right, and what he did is he illegally leased this to some businessmen, some oilmen, Sinclair and Doheny. And what he did is he took bribes for that. So he was prosecuted and went to jail, but they were acquitted on the charges. Maybe they didn't know what was going on. I don't know why they were acquitted. And then here we have our Attorney General Doherty. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his name. But this was during Prohibition, right? He was giving permits during this time and pardons to different people for money, right? So it's very corrupt. These people within Harding's administration are, getting rich off the American taxpayer and through very corrupt means. Okay, then Harding dies. He goes on this trip out west. I mean, really did it up big. He goes to Alaska and Washington, Oregon, and then down into California. He's at the presidential suite at I don't know what hotel in Pneumonia. It was questionable. A lot of people have guessed that he was killed. And some people even believe that he was killed by his wife. And some people say that he was killed by his wife because he was having an affair with another woman and even had a love child. Other historians dispute that, say, no, that never happened. He died of some respiratory ailment, right? He just passed away. So he dies, and then Calvin Coolidge is sworn in by his father, who is a judge, at their home in Vermont, and he becomes vice president, right? And then what's going to happen is all of those scandals that occurred during Harding's administration are going to come to light. Okay, so this is Calvin Coolidge. He's really quiet. They call him Silent Cal. The thing about him, if we were in the classroom, we would watch The Presidents. It's one of my favorite ones to do because he always liked to dress up in goofy uniforms, right? Like an Indian headdress or as a cowboy. And I guess that for exercise, he had this mechanical bull that he would right after dinner, right? So he's very pro-business. He supports everything that Andrew Mellon does. He wants to cut taxes, balance the budget. He wants laissez-faire government, so small government, right? He wants to keep it very small, few regulations, and he's from Massachusetts. All right, so, but things are not going well at this time. There's some real problems that are starting to occur. One, as I mentioned before, is that there's a huge surplus of farm goods, right? And so because there's so much, the supply is high and the demand is low, prices are low. But the problem with that is that farmers are in debt. They have bought newfangled equipment, land, made improvements, those sorts of things. So it's really problematic for the farmers. They were producing a lot of goods during World War I for Europe, but after the war, then Europe starts to produce its own farm equipment. So in the 1920s, we start to see that 1 in 4 farmers sold for debt or taxes during that time. So even though the number of farmers decreases, the size of the farm increases because a farmer could farm more land with less labor. Right? So here we have a couple of attempts by the federal government to aid the farmer. One is the Cooper-Volstead Act. Volstead, probably the same guy with the Volstead Act, which regulated prohibition. But anyway, here it said that farmers could go into their cooperatives and they were going to be exempt from, you know, trust prosecution. So they could have a cooperative, they could have a collective. Businesses couldn't do it, but farming organizations could. And then there's the McNary-Haugen bill. This was really a missed opportunity. Here, what they did, our government today subsidizes farmers, you know, not to grow crops, because it's still a problem that we've had, you know, since Jamestown and growing too much tobacco, is that we have always had a surplus of agricultural products, and this was no exception. So this law would have allowed the government to do that, right? It was proposed by Republicans, but it was vetoed by Republicans too. Calvin Coolidge vetoed it twice. Okay, so this is an example of some of the newfangled farm equipment. Do you remember back when we were looking at agriculture in the late 1800s, they had combines and reapers. They had combines at that time, what cuts and also separates the grain. These right here, you know, I think that this is a plow. Or disc, they're disking the land with these steam-powered tractors, right? So it had really advanced, but to keep up, you can't just go buy these things. Oftentimes they'd get loans from the bank, but they could do a vast territory or vast area of land to plant the crops. Okay, and then this right here, it shows the export of crops that start to go down after World War I. They really peaked up there in like 1918, and then they just started to go down. You're going to see, look at 1929 when the Great Depression strikes here in the United States, and it continues down after that. Okay, so Calvin Coolidge, he took over as president when Harney died in 22, and then he's running again. He's going to run for president in 1924. So the Republicans chose him, and then the Democrats chose a man by the name of John Davis. Now the Democrats really is problematic because they are split. You've got wets and you have dries. You have people who are from the city and from the farm. You have people who are modernists and people who are fundamentalists. And so they're kind of split on their beliefs there. And some of them kind of go over, you could say maybe some Republicans did too, and they vote for the progressive Bob La Follette. La Follette only won one state, and that was his own home state of Wisconsin. What he really campaigned on is he has more of a socialist agenda, right? He wanted the government to give relief to farmers because he could see what was happening to farmers, but he also wanted the government to own the railroad. This is something that the populists were calling for in the 1870s, right? Well, Coolidge won by a pretty good margin. He got 34 of 12 states. I'm not sure what that is. So anyway, he had a I think it was 34 to 12 states, 382 electoral votes to 136, and he was a very popular president, right? A woman, I guess, at a dinner, like I said, he's really quiet. A woman asked him one time, "I bet I can get you to say 3 words," and he turned to her and said, "You lose." He wouldn't say anything else. But anyway, don't know why it was so popular. So this is the map. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yep, that was it. So 34, he got 34 states to Davis's 12. And then you could see up there that La Follette got his home state of Wisconsin. But he got a pretty good chunk. What is that? 54% of the popular vote, but almost 72 percent or 72 percent of the electoral vote. All right, so our floundering foreign policy, right? This is the aftermath of World War I, and it's really kind of ridiculous. So remember with the Versailles Treaty, the Europeans wanted to punish Germany, and so what they did is they charged them reparations. They had to pay reparations on it, and so Germany is supposed to give all this money to England and France. England and France had borrowed money from American investors prior to the war. And a lot England and France thought that that debt should be forgiven because they suffered so much more during the war than the United States did, right? So it was really this weird situation where Germany was paying England and France money from reparations. England and France was paying the United States for what they owed, and then the United States was giving money to Germany to pay reparations. So it was all a big mess, right? So they wanted the payments, 32, $33 billion. France even sent troops into the Ruhr Valley, which they were occupying. And the Deutschmark, it was the value was deflated, but they had vast inflation, right? So it'd take 480 Deutschmark for a loaf of bread. So when I was in Germany in the 1980s, and I would do my monetary exchange, I think that I would get 4 Deutschmarks for $1. So you can tell this was really bad for the Germans, and the writing is on the wall that this depression is coming. So anyway, the England and France want us to forgive the debt or just cancel it out all completely. Then we get this plan, right? So here's what it, well, before we get to the plan. So here you've got these American investors, right? And that's Wall Street bankers. They had given loans. They're giving loans to Germany. Germany is paying England and they are paying France, right? The debt payment. From that, that's going to the U.S. Treasury. And so it just kind of is this circle that is occurring here, right? And so it couldn't be sustained. So this guy Charles Dawes, he will become the vice president, and let's see, he's elected in 1924. Right. But anyway, he ended up coming up with this plan to reschedule the reparations. And then also the U.S. banks start to loan money to Germany to pay the reparations. And then the Allies were supposed to pay their debt there. And then when everything crashed, Herbert Hoover is going to have this moratorium where basically they halt the debt because finances dry up everywhere. The only country that ever repaid all of their debt to the United States was little old Finland in 1976. Dawes, for his part, gets a Nobel Peace Prize for this. A lot of people are getting peace prizes. All right, don't forget or don't confuse that Dawes with this Dawes Act. Remember the other Dawes Act of 1887? This one said that Native Americans could get land, also that they were going to go off of the reservation and get rid of the communal living and start living more like independent people. All right, this is just section 1. I broke it up so that you wouldn't have to sit for so long. So I will record section 2 and get that one to you too. Section 2 of chapter 32. Thank you for listening.